Hi, everyone. This is Phil Travis, and this is a companion presentation to the presentation on 1860. This presentation discusses the beginning of the war, particularly in the years 1861. It also discusses the realities of the Civil War in terms of technology, how the war was fought. It was an industrial war, and so what this war looked like and what were the consequences of this kind of war for the people fighting it.
Of course, the war began at Fort Sumter on April 12th, 1861. After the raid on Fort Sumter, when it became clear that Lincoln would expect all Union states, including southern states like Virginia, to provide support and service in bringing the rebellious Deep South states back into the Union. Once that became apparent, for the last four states to secede, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and Arkansas did so. And of course, after that declaration, Lincoln had to go to great lengths at the beginning of the war to keep the four non-seceded border states in the Union: Arkansas, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And he went to great lengths to do that, to maintain those states in the Union. But before Fort Sumter, Lincoln did not have a lot of options because there was, of course, the Crittenden's Compromise that was offered. But even though Crittenden's Compromise was not something that Lincoln could have accepted either, Crittenden's Compromise was not something that the Deep South states were willing to accept. Crittenden's Compromise, of course, offered that the Missouri Compromise line, the 3630 line, be extended to the sea, to the Pacific coast, and the southern states and potentially future states, maybe Cuba, as had been some talk, could become slave states, and the others would be free states. It was kind of a return to the pre-1850s popular sovereignty dictated way of dealing with the slave issue. So Crittenden's Compromise, while Lincoln didn't really feel he could accept it, he felt that, it was just a matter of appeasing the South, and that if you continue to appease the Confederate states, that you're just going to keep on having these crises roll over and over, as they had really for 4 decades almost up to this point. But the thing about it is that the Deep South states were adamant that they had no intention of negotiating a return back to the Union. In 1861, they had seceded, and they were ready to stand by their secession. They had drawn up a constitution, elected a cabinet and president, and they were not planning on signing a compromise to come back into the Union. Of course, Lincoln's options. One might say, well, what are Lincoln's options here? Well, he really has two options. And one is to wait it out, to recognize the South and find a way over the long term to bring the South back into the Union. And actually, when Lincoln's challenged in the election of 1864, there's people who take that position, that somehow Lincoln should just kind of agree to allow the South to be, the Confederacy to be sovereign, and hopefully over time find a way to get them back in the Union. Of course, Lincoln does not want that route because, of course, if you recognize them, it's much more likely that the divide would become permanent. And Lincoln felt strongly that the Union had to be restored, that it was in the best interest of the country, economically and as a world power, if it remained united. And I think we would all agree that he was right about that. So then the other option is to find a way to maintain a balance that could keep border states within the Union and exert a slow pressure on the South to bring them back into the Union. And of course, the first focal point was Fort Sumter, and Fort Sumter was designed really as a diplomatic game for Lincoln, a diplomatic trick, if you will, or maybe not a trick, but a diplomatic maneuver by Lincoln. Lincoln at Fort Sumter, of course, basically says to General Beauregard, who is the commanding force who's going to siege Anderson's troops at Fort Sumter, he effectively says to the Southern leadership and Jefferson Davis that I'm going to resupply my troops at the fort with humanitarian supplies. And what Lincoln knew is that he knew that if the South attacked, which they do, of course, that it makes the South look like the aggressor, and then it justifies Lincoln taking more aggressive actions on the Confederacy. If the Confederacy allowed the resupply operation, then it somehow lessened the legitimacy of the Confederacy. Of course, the Confederacy is going to decide to attack, and actually there was one small vocal opponent to the Confederate attack, and that was Secretary of State Toombs. The Secretary of State in the Confederacy said, you should not attack, because if you attack, you're going to give the justification to the North, and you're going to create a war, basically. And, of course, that is what ultimately occurred. So, the most significant weapon of all during the Civil War, I would have to say, would probably be the muzzle-loading rifle, pictured here. And particularly because rifling technology, when coupled with the advent of a different kind of projectile, the mini ball, pictured here, proved to be far more deadly in warfare, because the rifle is more accurate over a longer range than the weapons that were used prior. And the weapons that were used prior would be smoothbore muskets, the types of weapons that were used in the American Revolution, for example. A smoothbore musket, which would fire a large ball, was very inaccurate over long ranges. And so traditional battlefield techniques were you fired infantry volleys at close range and at the command of your officer. The rifle, however, rifles have grooves on the inside of the barrel, and the mini balls, you see the grooves on the base of the mini ball. The mini ball was designed, and these were percussion-capped weapons, if anybody's interested in that kind of thing. But the mini ball was designed to expand at the base, and that would cause it to grip into the grooves in the rifle, which would spin it out, and it would come out of the rifle at a much, much greater velocity, which made it more accurate over a longer range. Now, there were other kinds of weapons used in the war, of course, sidearms for officers, and the Confederacy, by and large, had a more diverse array of firearms. You would see more shotguns and that kind of thing in the Confederate units. There were some breech-loading rifles as well, but by and large, whether Union or Confederate, a muzzle-loading rifle of the nature pictured here is what you would see. And that rifle was incredibly devastating, incredibly significant for the devastating nature of this war. The American Civil War is unprecedented in the scale of death. Battles like Shiloh Church, you see 10,000 people die. Some major Civil War battles last days. The Battle of Gettysburg lasted 3 days. And casualties could be well into the thousands, with fields of battle strewn with the dead and dying. Artillery during the Civil War also was at a highly advanced stage for this time period. Artillery, was not new during the Civil War, but during the Civil War you see a more diverse array in the evolution of artillery technology. You saw explosive shells, some explosive shells that were designed to explode over top of soldiers, thus raining shrapnel down on the enemy ranks. You had mortar-style artillery that was used in sieges. You had canister shot. And canister shot or grape shot is certainly one of the most frightening ones to think of. The canister shot or the grape shot was used particularly when trying to fend off an infantry charge. And the canister shot basically was a blast out of the cannon that shot shrapnel, little pieces of metal and these types of things, rocks even, that would be blasted against the attacking infantry with the hope of breaking up an infantry charge. The Civil War really sees a lot of older techniques in warfare come into usage with new technologies. And because of this is one of the factors why the war is so deadly. Many of the forces in the war still fought on command of an officer at times. you oftentimes had battles in which troops fought rather close together. And in fact, the closeness of the quarters fighting coupled with the rifle could actually have a negative impact on the offensive unit's artillery, because artillery during an offensive might come into contact with the defensive forces at such a range where riflemen could pick off artillery units. So a lot of times the artillery was best used, in some cases, not all, but best used in a defensive format. You had cavalry that was used during the Civil War, but cavalry a lot of times in the Civil War was used a little bit differently. And some of the great cavalry officers, Jeb Stuart, of course, for the Confederacy. George Armstrong Custer was actually one of the great cavalry officers for the Union. And cavalry was often used to outflank an enemy opponent by using your speed. Famously, during the Peninsula Campaign in the early period of the war, during the so-called 7 Days Battle, Jeb Stuart famously rode all the way around the perimeter of General George B. McClellan's troops, thus confusing them and causing great problems for the Union in that battle, which wound up being one of Lee's great victories. But cavalry was also a little bit different. Generally speaking, the cavalry during the during the Civil War, the cavalry did not fight on horseback. They rarely would have gone into an engagement riding on their horses. You would have been a much greater target for the now much more accurate rifles if you had done that. And so the cavalry actually used to, after conducting maybe a flanking operation, for example, the cavalry would dismount and then fight more as an irregular infantry unit. In addition to this, you also do not just have more traditional infantry engagements with volleys and commands from officers and that kind of thing. You also had skirmishes. Skirmishes were when you had units that were positioned on the flanks or towards the front or even the rear of a battle, and in a skirmish, soldiers fired at will, and these were smaller groups that would skirmish in some of the peripheral areas of a battle. The Civil War, of course, is an industrial war of attrition. That's what it becomes. And to call something a war of attrition really has kind of two meanings. The basic meaning of a war of attrition is it's a war that is determined by who can last the most, who can accept the greater cost. That's generally what a war of attrition is. But oftentimes we take that to assume that the only side that can fight a war of attrition are the ones who have the most people and the most resources and that kind of thing. And certainly that often is the case. But the Confederacy also considered fighting a style of attrition warfare, which meant basically fighting defensively long enough to outlast the enemy, the Union in this case's desire to wage the war. And the Confederacy, as McPherson in your book notes, the Confederacy sort of did a hybrid of offensive war and defensive attrition war, where, of course, Lee would launch multiple attacks into Union territory with the hope, two major invasions into Union territory, with the hope of securing a major treaty agreement, but they also fought a war that was designed to be defensive and was designed to hold out long enough to which the Union would give in because it would have accepted that the cost was too great. Of course, that does not occur. So they fought kind of a hybrid war of attrition. But for the North, it was also a war of attrition. For the North, this war becomes basically a war that is won largely because of the North's overwhelming population, resources, and industrial capacity. The North had a much greater industrial capacity than the South. And they also had a much greater population, and they had a lot of officers. They had more officers than the South did. Granted, the South, you would say, at least when you talk about Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, seemed to have better officers. But that's probably not a universal thing you would actually apply in all cases. But Lee, Jackson, Jeb Stuart are three of the greatest officers in American military history. There's a lot of new technologies in this war. Of course, we mentioned the artillery technology with cannons and mortar artillery and explosive shells, the rifle. Of course, it's also a conflict of ironclads. Ironclads were these armor-plated ships, and they were a precursor to the future of naval war. These were steam-powered vessels. Ships like the CSS Virginia, for example. And they were originally designed, as I'll mention a little bit later in this presentation, originally designed to break the Union blockade. But the North actually ultimately produces more than the South. Medicine is highly antiquated at this time. There's no antiseptics. Infection was a rampant problem. Nearly 20% of wounded soldiers died of infection. It's a huge problem. There are some painkillers. There is morphine and chloroform, but oftentimes it wasn't available, and so in some cases a soldier would have to bite the bullet if they had to receive an amputation. Because the mini ball and these types of weapons were high caliber, if you received a wound in the leg or the arm in a limb, it would often shatter a bone, which meant you would need to have it amputated. Amputations were obviously very, very difficult things to endure if you didn't have something like chloroform or morphine available. And the surgeons often looked like butchers at this time, and there were generally piles of limbs in some cases and white coats covered in blood. They used to reuse the same bandages. They'd wash them off and reuse them. They didn't have an understanding of infection and these types of things at this time. Oftentimes, especially in the border regions of the United States, you had family members fighting each other. Family members from Virginia fought other family members from North Carolina and Virginia and Tennessee, particularly in the border areas, Kentucky, Missouri, Virginia, these areas, North Carolina, Tennessee, you saw a lot of people fighting one way or the other. And so you had family members fighting family members often. The so-called mountain whites, which were these kind of Appalachia hillbillies, if you will. That's where the term hillbilly comes from. And many of them actually helped West Virginia form its own northern Union-oriented state during the war. But some 50,000 of them fought for the Union, despite the fact that many of them were either part of Virginia or Tennessee. Andrew Johnson, who became president, was from Tennessee. He was the only politician to not secede with his state. It's an incredibly deadly conflict, and the new technology in the conflict creates an industrial war with incredible death and incredible casualty rates. Over 600,000 dead. And of course, battlefield medicine has changed tremendously, and it changes to a degree during the Civil War. But compared to what we're used to today, it was very, very antiquated. Even though towards the latter stages of the war, you do start seeing ambulances that begin to, where nurses and doctors go to the field to remove the dead and dying soldiers from the field of battle to receive treatment. So, Union advantages. You see here a map in the beige, obviously depicts the seceded southern states. In the green are the Union states, and of course in the dark green are the border states. And the border states are all those states that, did not secede but had slaves, but were slave states. So the Union advantage, first of all, was one, its manpower and population. Many more people lived in the North. The North was industrializing, which brought increased immigration from Europe and increased population. That industry also is an advantage because it will allow the North to produce the types of military supplies required to wage the kind of total war of attrition that the Civil War will become. Also, one advantage the North has is with these border states. These border states that don't secede, and Lincoln went to great lengths to keep these states in the Union because they were important. For one reason, it gave you a place from which you could attack Southern strengths in places like the Mississippi River, as well as right at the Southern capital, Richmond in Virginia. However, you also have issues in these states as in regarding railroad lines, but not only railroad lines. I mean, when you think about Maryland, I mean, if Maryland had seceded, the capital, Washington D.C., would have been basically it would have been surrounded by Confederate states, and so it was really important to keep those border states in. And by keeping the border states in, that certainly served an advantage to the Union. The Union has a naval advantage as well. And has a wealth advantage, some 3/4 of the nation's wealth. Also, Abraham Lincoln, an exceptional leader in the executive office, and the fact that the North has a stable and established government. That's a big advantage for the North because the South is forming a government while it's fighting a war, basically. The North has a government that can carry out important things that are necessary for the conduct of the war. Things like declaring a blockade, raising an army. Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus as well. Writ of habeas corpus, of course, is the constitutional right for you to be, free from being imprisoned without charge, basically. It was suspended in these border states, and Lincoln had Southern conspirators arrested, which was needed to keep some of those border states like Maryland from revolting and seceding themselves. Also, the power of the president to suspend free press and these types of things in these border areas. I know those sound like controversial types of actions, but we have to remember that the border states were integral from a standpoint of strategy, and the populations were somewhat divided in those areas, and it was really important that you keep those states from revolting and falling out of the Union. Of course, Confederacy military leadership pictured here, Robert E. Lee, also, of course, Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart. The South had some exceptional leaders, particularly military leaders. I mean, their political leaders were actually bad, like Jefferson Davis. But military leaders, and it wasn't, and your book mentions this, that it's not to say that they had this massive advantage over the North in terms of all the Southern leaders were somehow good and the Northern leaders weren't. But it was the case that the South had a handful of leaders, particularly Lee, his right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson, and his cavalryman, Jeb Stuart. And those three were really a very impressive group of leaders, especially Robert E. Lee, which really was an advantage for the South. And of course, Robert E. Lee was asked to be the commander of the Army of the Potomac for the North, and he chose to secede with Virginia. Virginia was a state that, of course, seceded after the fact, really after the war had begun, after it became clearly apparent that they would have to fight against the South. Was only when Virginia and, of course, Tennessee and North Carolina and Missouri wound up, or not Missouri, Arkansas wound up seceding. And Robert E. Lee made the difficult decision to not fight against the people that he considered his Southern nation, his Southern family, his Southern section, and he chose instead to join the ranks of the Southern Confederacy. He first worked with Jefferson Davis in war planning, and then he joined relatively early on. He joined the Army of Northern Virginia, and has become one of the most famous American military minds in the country's history. Other advantages, the Confederacy, generally it's accepted that they overall had probably better marksmen. They may have had better soldiers. There's some debate over that. The rebel yell is, of course, a term that refers to the kind of war cries that Southern soldiers sometimes let out when they launched an infantry charge. The biggest advantage I would say the Confederacy probably had is the fact that they were fighting a defensive war, which is always an easier thing to do than fight an offensive war. Of course, also nationalism. They were defending their homeland in their view, and they also believed they were defending their state's rights to secede, and what they believed was the kind of original idea of the Constitution. That was their belief. By contrast, Union soldiers too fought for what they believed the Constitution was all about, and Union soldiers too fought with great nationalism and pride to preserve the Union. But of course, they weren't in the same way defending their homeland. So perhaps nationalism slightly to a higher extent for the Southerners. Some of the disadvantages for the North. One of the disadvantages was difficulty finding good leadership. It really wasn't until Ulysses S. Grant that the United States finds, that Lincoln finds good leaders to lead his army. They have to defeat the South, which is more difficult. And you might say that their soldiers are slightly lower quality. There's some debate over that issue. In the South, of course, the South lacks industry. They have really no navy. To call it a weak navy is actually, giving them something. They really have no real navy to speak of. They're poor and vulnerable in terms of logistics. Their railroad lines, their capitals are located very close. Their capital is located close to the north. Their key railroad lines and ports are located oftentimes close to the north. So they have some vulnerable logistical issues. Slavery is too an issue because especially after emancipation, this will be a huge issue for them behind the rears of their fighting. The slave population, that many of them left their plantations, and some of them joined the fight against the North, against the South for the North. Jefferson Davis too was a very, very poor leader, and he created a lot of animosities within the Confederacy. The Confederacy too was a very young government. They were forming their government as the war was beginning, and that was a disadvantage, of course. States' rights, the idea of states' rights, also made it difficult for Davis to exercise full authority when it came to things like taxation, conscription, and so forth. The objectives. The North's objective is basically to preserve the Union. Abolition does not begin as the unifying factor behind the war, and in fact, abolition was controversial. Had the war originally begun fought for abolition, it's true that most people in the North probably would have opposed it. But the goal was to preserve the Union for the North, and you preserve the Union by, we'll talk about some of the specific objectives in their strategy on the next slide. The South's objectives were to protect their sovereignty and their right as what they believed as voluntary participants in the United States to secede. Their primary goal was to protect the sovereignty of the Confederate States. The strategy for the South, so how do you win the war for the South? The strategy for the South is really to get the international community and the Union, of course, to recognize it as a legitimate and independent country. They believed they could do this first by catering to European powers. The British offered some kind of I guess, pseudo-assistance to the South. The British didn't openly and directly assist the South, but there were the construction of some commerce raiders like the Alabama that actually captured quite a few U.S. merchant ships. Though after the Battle of Antietam, you will see Lord Palmerston exercise restraint over this issue as they will decide not to recognize the South. The French, too, overthrew the Mexican government and put the Austrian Archduke Maximilian in power in Mexico. Sorry for that typo. In 1863. So there was an international interest in the conflict, and the South did appeal to the international powers. And one of their goals was to get the international community to recognize it. And through that, encourage them to help them in the war and encourage them to force the Union to recognize them. The key thing in the actual fighting of the war for the South was that they sought to win major victories. Threaten the capital, Washington, D.C., or major cities in the North, and force Washington to sign a treaty by winning major victories, potentially major victories on northern soil near the capital or in the capital. By contrast, the Union strategy, which was embodied really in what's called the Anaconda Plan, was on one side to blockade the South, to embargo them, so make it impossible for them to carry out the war, and to take the southern capital of Richmond. Initially, there was a great intent on the North to avoid civilian killing, avoid the population. Later, however, as the war develops into kind of a total war of attrition, there's also total war on the southern population, which was directed through emancipation in the southern states, destruction of farms, and of course, the most infamous case being Sherman's March to the Sea. And this happens as the war becomes more of a total war of attrition. Excuse me. Both the North and the South used conscription, the draft. The vast majority of Union troops were volunteers. The draft was largely used to encourage volunteers. There was some opposition to the draft, and there were some draft riots. There was also in both the North and the South, you could purchase an exemption to the draft and purchase exemption to military service. There's deserters on both sides. And by and large, in the South, conscription placed a much greater demand on the populace, as it was a smaller population and it was more difficult for the South, which was substantially outnumbered militarily. It was more difficult for them to carry on through a long-term war. And so you saw conscription in 1862 for all those able-bodied men, 17 to 50. So it was a much more thorough demand on the populace in the South. This map shows you the Anaconda Plan as it's kind of in place. You can see the dark purple in the southern areas that goes down to New Orleans, which is the result of important victories like the Battle of Shiloh Church in 1862. And of course, the dotted line indicates the areas where which the blockade would have been placed around the South. And so the South is blockaded, and over the long run, this is going to be a key factor in depriving the South the ability to make war and ultimately forcing the South to succumb. So the war, particularly in the last 2 years, becomes increasingly dominated by the naval war, at least the realities inside the Confederacy. And what I mean by that is the naval war, the naval blockade of the South by 63, 64, and of course 65 really increasingly came to damage the Southern economy and of course the supply of the Southern soldiers. The blockade, of course, is very difficult. In this cartoon, this is a political cartoon. Here it depicts Winfield Scott's it depicts Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan. It's obviously an artistic rendition of the plan to use a blockade to surround the South, cut them off, undermine their economy, undermine the ability of them to make war, and use that as a way to ultimately bring them to their knees and surrender. The U.S. had the Union or the United States had a very small navy at the outset of the war. Over time, though, we do build up a very large navy, and we had 150 to 200 boats patrolling the coast at any particular time by this period of the war. However, it's a very difficult thing to enforce. It's a huge effort. The coastline we're talking about is over 3,000 miles. There's also, control of the Mississippi River. It's a big deal. And it's a hard thing to do, but it was becoming increasingly effective in the latter period of the war. Now, the Confederacy's response to the Union blockade they really have to be innovative. They have to use innovative technology to try to break the blockade, to try to nullify the blockade. One of these was the uses of ironclads. Pictured here is the CSS Virginia. Some ironclads had iron hulls. Lots of ironclads were wooden ships that were fitted out with iron plates. The ironclad was designed to be used to break blockades held by less fortified wooden ships. And of course, the CSS Virginia had sunk a couple of ships in its inaugural missions in the Chesapeake Bay area, trying to break the blockade. Of course, the Union built ironclads too, and the USS Monitor, one of the most famous, but they built ironclads too, and ultimately built more of them than the South, and so it kind of nullified that advantage they were trying to get. Another example, of course, is the submarine, the CSS Hunley. What you're looking at here actually is not a submarine. This is a commerce raider. I'll show you an image of the Hunley in just a second. But submarines like the CSS Hunley, which was basically an early rudimentary submarine, and it did sink a boat, the Housatonic, though it did sink itself in the mission, but it did nonetheless sink a boat in Charleston Harbor before itself sinking. And the Hunley has been raised, by the way. And if you are ever happen in Charleston, when you go down there through 26 in down by Charleston, you can see the signs for the Hunley, and you can go see the Hunley. There are also the Confederates used what they called torpedoes, but they're really naval mines that they would put in harbors to try to make it more difficult for Union forces to take ports. They also used commerce raiders, as you see right here. Commerce raiders, particularly ones built by the British, like the CSS Alabama, the CSS Florida. These boats were very effective, and they were designed to attack Union merchant vessels. And actually, they were pretty effective in attacking Union merchant vessels. But the problem was that the Union relied increasingly on trade from foreign vessels, from both the British and other foreign European powers. And of course, the South made sure not to attack those ships, especially as it was increasingly hoping that maybe it could get international cooperation. This is a drawing of the Hunley. It wasn't a big craft, but you can see it definitely has the shape of a submarine, of an early era submarine. This is the boat that it sunk, steamer that it sank in Charleston Harbor before itself actually sinking. This is an image, well, not an image, it's a painting, obviously, of the Battle of Mobile Bay. And I like this because it shows, the technologies, the two technologies kind of coming in together, where you see ironclad steamers. These are steam-powered vessels, ironclad vessels fighting steam-powered wooden ships. You can kind of see masted vessels there coming up against these steam-powered ironclads, this new technology, this technology of the future in some respects of naval warfare. The home fronts in the North, you have your first income tax. It's a wartime tax, so it's not a permanent thing. But they use income tax. They raise tariff duties. They print greenbacks, meaning currency that wasn't supported by gold or silver. There's bond sales. They establish a national bank. And in the North, there's also, for some, a wartime prosperity boom. It created the first real millionaire class in the North. You had the development of sewing machines, which created the uniforms for the soldiers. It's during this time that you actually have the development of traditionally what we think of as clothes sizes. It's also in the North in 1859. We have the development of oil. We have the discovery of oil in Pennsylvania, so-called Drake's Folly. There's a lot of women in industry during the war, just as you saw during World War II and other American conflicts like World War I. Nurses like Dorothy D., Clara Barton, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell were revolutionary women in terms of developing improvements in sanitary conditions in hospitals and assisting fallen soldiers on the battlefields. The Southern home front experienced increased taxes, the printing of bluebacks, similar to the greenbacks, which ultimately they experienced runaway inflation as a result of this. Towards the end of the war, the Southern economy really collapsed. They suffered import issues. There were difficulty in organizing things because of arguments over states' rights. There was a loss in wealth, and cotton production decreases profoundly. So the first true battle of the Civil War was the Battle of Manassas or Bull Run. Bull Run is the nearby stream. There's two ways of naming a lot of these battles. The North and South varied. One strategy was to name the battles after the nearest town, Manassas. The other, the nearest creek or river, Bull Run. The Battle of Manassas was designed to send General Irving McDowell with Union forces south to take ultimately the southern capital of Richmond, which was, of course, located, both of the capitals were located very close to each other. This is in July of 1861. The idea was that Irving McDowell, that his forces could advance and engage the Southern commander Beauregard's forces, which were encamped at Manassas. If he could defeat Beauregard's force, the idea was he could then win a major victory and move on Richmond. No one ever expected the Vietnam War. Listen to me. No one ever expected the Civil War to become a long, drawn-out kind of battle of attrition. No one expected it to last as long as it did. No one expected it to ravage the South the way that it did. And no one expected it to take the cost in human lives that it did. And people mainly thought that there might be a few battles and then there would be a treaty and it would be over. And certainly this held true with the Battle of Manassas. And many expected the Union forces to win an easy victory and the war would be over. I call it sometimes the picnic battle because people came out to watch the battle expecting this Union victory and ultimate capture of Richmond. Of course, what happens is Joseph Johnson's forces were moved by train. The first movement of a major amount of troops to a battlefield by train ever, and together the two Southern forces defeated the Union forces at Manassas and sent the Union Army running in a very disorganized fashion. And people and the forces fled back to the capital city. It was a absolutely crushing defeat and victory for Beauregard, even though the Southern forces were not together enough to actually pursue them to the capital. But it was a quick victory for the South, and it served as a wake-up call for the North, that there would be no quick victories, that there would be a need for a longer, more involved conflict. Before this, the people who went to serve with the Union were signed up for 3 months. After this, the Lincoln administration will learn that they have to conscript people for, or that they have to have people sign up for longer, generally a 3-year period. It also encouraged overconfidence from the South. In the South, there were increasing desertions after this, and enlistments dropped off as they kind of assumed that this war would be, more or less of an afterthought.